The senator from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak in opposition to President Trump's nominee to serve as Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin. From his days at Goldman Sachs on the front lines of developing the very products that brought our economy to its knees, to his reign as chairman of One West Bank, quantified by tens of thousands of foreclosures and qualified by years of despair, to his plan to get rich off cash-strapped seniors, to his investments in Sears that stripped pension benefits from low-wage earners, Mr. Mnuchin made a career out of exploiting the financial turmoil of hardworking American families, never once stopping to consider the impacts of his profiteering on the people of this country. At every step of the way, Mr. Mnuchin's mantra has been to privatize profits and socialize losses. While our president spent much of his campaign railing against Goldman Sachs and Wall Street's stranglehold on Washington, it should be lost on no one that Wall Street has the majority vote in this administration. With friends like Mr. Mnuchin and Gary Cohn in high places, the country's largest and most complex financial institutions can rest easy, knowing this administration is firmly committed to their bottom lines. And as Treasury Secretary, Mr. Mnuchin will be a chief architect of the GOP's, quote, Wall Street first policy. Despite his self-described humble beginnings at Goldman Sachs in the 1980s, Mr. Mnuchin was on the front lines of developing the now infamous collateralized debt obligations known as CDOs and credit default swaps. I urge my colleagues not to be fooled by Mr. Mnuchin. He was part of the cadre of corporate raiders that brought our economy to its knees. In its 2011 report on the Great Recession, which wiped out nearly $13 trillion in household wealth and cost nearly 9 million Americans their jobs, the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations described Goldman Sachs' role in the crisis as follows, quote, Goldman engaged in securitization practices that magnified risk in the market by selling high-risk, poor-quality mortgage products. It said, quote, conflicts of interest related to proprietary investments led Goldman to conceal its adverse financial interests from potential investors, sell investors poor quality investments, and place its financial interests before those of its clients. Despite the damage they caused, Mr. Mnuchin never learned this lesson. And as recently as 2012, he praised these instruments, calling them, quote, an extremely positive development in terms of being able to finance different parts of the economy and different businesses efficiently. Now, after he left Goldman Sachs, Mr. Mnuchin started a hedge fund, Dune Capital, which explored investing in an exotic financial instrument called life settlements, which are made up of life insurance policies purchased from cash-strapped seniors. The investor, Mr. Mnuchin's hedge fund, had a plan to pay the premiums on the policies until the seniors died, at which point they would cash in on the insurance claims. So let's be clear here. Under Mr. Mnuchin's plan, the sooner seniors died, the more money his hedge fund would make. And while the market for this product collapsed before Mr. Mnuchin could cash in, we had to ask ourselves, is this the type of leader that we want at the helm of our economy? Do we really want a Treasury Secretary who had a plan to get rich off of dying seniors? And that brings us to the end of 2008, early 2009. Wall Street had brought our economy to the brink of collapse. 13.2 million Americans were facing unemployment. Home values were plummeting, having fallen 12.5% in just one quarter. And where was Mr. Mnuchin? He was negotiating the deal of a lifetime. In the darkest days of the financial crisis, when Rome was burning, Mr. Mnuchin and his friends were looking for stores to raid. And boy, did they find a gem in IndyMac. He purchased IndyMac's $23.5 billion of assets for a mere $1.55 billion in March of 2009, with the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance entity, backing if too many loans went south. So he had a governmental guarantee, bought $23.5 billion of assets for about $1.5 billion, and he had the government's guarantee. All that Mr. Mnuchin had to do was to agree to help homeowners struggling with their mortgages. But Mr. Mnuchin didn't hold up his end of the bargain. He wanted more. Apparently, the profit margins of foreclosure were just too sweet to ignore. After buying IndyMac and renaming it One West Bank, Mr. Mnuchin was installed as chairman. But instead of working to achieve sustainable loan modifications and workouts for struggling borrowers, as Mr. Mnuchin had committed to doing, One West's business model centered on kicking borrowers out of their home at the first sign of default. In April of 2011, the former Office of Thrift Supervision hit One West Bank with a consent order because the bank was actually putting homeowners on a fast track to foreclosure, robo-signing foreclosure documents. In a sworn deposition in 2009, a One West vice president admitted to robo-signing 750 foreclosure documents a week without ever reading or reviewing them. In 2014, an independent government review of One West's foreclosure activities in 2009 and 2010 alone identified more than 10,000 homeowners, including dozens of active duty service members who were owed $8.5 million in damages due to the bank's foreclosure practices. And One West practices were especially egregious when it came to seniors with reverse mortgage loans. During Mr. Mnuchin's tenure at the bank, One West's reverse mortgage subsidiary, Financial Freedom, had approximately 17% of the reverse mortgage share, but was responsible for nearly 40% of reverse mortgage foreclosures. So in other words, Mr. Mnuchin cornered the market on focusing and foreclosing on seniors in America. Whether it was foreclosing on a 90-year-old woman over a 27-cent mispayment, or threatening to kick an 84-year-old widow out of her home of 54 years, Mr. Mnuchin was ruthless. And what did Mr. Mnuchin have to say about all of this when we asked him during his confirmation hearing during the Senate Finance Committee? He dodged responsibility at every step. First, he blamed IndyMac for the quality of mortgage loans. Then he blamed government regulations, which he falsely claimed forced his bank to kick people out of their homes. And if that wasn't enough, Mr. Mnuchin had the audacity to tell us that that his bank did not robo-sign documents despite clear evidence to the contrary. To make matters worse, Mr. Mnuchin had the gall to call One West a loan modification machine. He repeatedly misled the committee that One West provided more than 100,000 loan modifications, when in fact they'd modified less than a quarter of that amount. And on top of misleading the committee, Mr. Mnuchin has been unwilling to provide information on the number of borrowers that lost their homes during the time that he ran the bank. We believe that number is at least 60,000 families and seniors, but those numbers could even be higher. At the end of the day, this is about much more than numbers. It's about the seniors that are barely hanging on to their homes, their only source of wealth. It's about communities that were hit with a 1-2 punch of subprime loans in the years leading up to the crisis, only to face banks like One West with unrelenting foreclosure practices that stopped at nothing until they had kicked people out of their homes. It's about people like Sylvia Oliver of Scotch Plains, New Jersey. After her employer cut her hours in 2009, like so many other hardworking Americans at the time, she ran into difficulty paying her mortgage. And despite the fact that Ms. Oliver found a full-time job and applied 8 times for loan modifications, Mr. Mnuchin's bank denied each and every one of her applications. Ms. Oliver has been fighting to save her home for 7 years. She's hanging on by a thread. Her own words speak volumes about Mr. Mnuchin. She said, quote, It's been very painful and stressful, not knowing if my kids and my family are going to have a home to live in or if it's going to be foreclosed on. I would ask you to remember my experience when you consider whether Mr. Mnuchin is qualified to lead the Department of the Treasury. As the CEO and chair of One West Bank, Mr. Mnuchin had the opportunity to help families like mine with responsible loan modifications, and he didn't. I don't think this is a track record that anyone should be proud of. Well, Ms. Oliver's right. Mr. Mnuchin's record is not only undeserving of pride, it's shameful. While Mr. Mnuchin's business formula proved toxic for tens of thousands of hardworking American families and seniors, it was incredibly lucrative for Mr. Mnuchin and One West investors. He sold One West for $3.4 billion, a profit of $1.85 billion over just 6 years, making around $200 million for himself. That's a pretty nice return on investment. And while I am gravely concerned about Mr. Mnuchin's history of exploiting hardworking American families to line his own pockets, I'm equally concerned about his plan to unchain Wall Street. Mr. Mnuchin has made it his #1 priority to, quote, roll back Wall Street reform. As my friend Senator Brown has often said, our colleagues seem to have contracted a case of collective amnesia about the Great Recession. Just 8.5 years after the worst financial collapse in 80 years that put taxpayers on the line for billions in bailouts, the President, Republicans in Congress, and Mr. Mnuchin are chomping at the bit to take down the very protections that were put in place to prevent another catastrophe. I asked them, have we learned nothing? We know what this administration wants. It wants what the industry wants. On the day the President signed his Wall Street first executive order, Goldman Sachs shares soared 4.6%, a $4 billion gain. $4 billion. And at the end of the day, Mr. Mnuchin is nominated to serve in a position to ensure the financial stability of the American economy. But his only experience is betting on the financial instability of American families. Not only did he profit off the backs of struggling homeowners, he also stands to profit off of pensions he mismanaged while on the board of the Sears Company. From the time Mr. Mnuchin joined the board of Sears, the company lost billions of dollars, including more than $8 billion since 2011 alone. Rather than invest in growth and its workers, he decided to strip the company of its most valuable assets and keep them for themselves and their friends. Now, while Sears seemed to lose from this transaction, there were some that certainly appeared to profit. Not surprising, Mr. Mnuchin and his hedge fund friends were those profiteers. As a shareholder lawsuit contended, they gobbled up the most valuable and profitable assets, and they saved golden parachutes for themselves to escape if the company crashed. Now, this might sound complicated, but it's a move that would make Gordon Gekko from the movie Wall Street proud. Just replace Blue Star Airlines with Sears, and fiction becomes reality. In the world of both men, greed is good. But this isn't a movie. It's a real world with real-life consequences for 200,000 people who work at Sears. Stripping Sears of $12 billion worth of its most valuable assets contributed to the devaluation of the company, which further jeopardized the pensions of more than 200,000 Americans. According to the most recent filing, this pension fund is now underfunded by an alarming $2 billion, after you strip $12 billion of its most valuable assets. And these retirees who rely on pensions to live, who worked hard all of their lives and played by the rules, have already had their benefits cut by Mr. Mnuchin and the Sears Finance Board. In fact, the pension situation has become so dire that the government, through the Pension Benefits Guarantee Corporation, or the PBGC, felt compelled to step in to protect the pension benefits for these 200,000 people. As if his past mismanagement of pensions isn't bad enough, as Treasury Secretary, Mr. Mnuchin would oversee the decision whether to bail out the pension. Mr. Mnuchin would have to decide whether to protect his personal hedge fund investments in Sears, which he refuses to divest, or to protect the federal government and those 200,000 retirees. Now, to be fair, when I asked Mr. Mnuchin about his inherent conflict of interest during his confirmation hearing, he pledged to recuse himself from any decision by the PBGC regarding Sears. But we've heard that song before. Mr. Mnuchin can't avoid a conflict of interest by recusing himself any more than President Trump can avoid a conflict by supposedly letting his children run his businesses. The only true firewall against a potential conflict of interest is through a full divestiture, which Mr. Mnuchin refuses to do. As a private citizen and executive at Sears, Mr. Mnuchin showed a total disregard for the earned pension benefits of hundreds of thousands of hardworking Americans. I have no reason to think he has a change of heart as the Treasury Secretary. Not only does Mr. Mnuchin want to let banks write their own rules and let executives profit when they cut pensions, but he also wants to cut taxes on the rich so he and his friends can keep more of their ill-gotten gains. After helping raise millions of dollars from Wall Street and big corporations for President Trump's campaign, they now expect a big return on their investment. And boy, do they win big league under the Mnuchin-Trump tax plan. This ill-conceived proposal would give large corporations that are already earning record profits an additional $2.5 trillion. That's $2.5 trillion taken away from transportation, from schools, from the middle class, given directly to multinational corporations. It would eliminate the estate tax and gift taxes, giving a nearly $200 billion windfall to the wealthiest 5,000 family dynasties in the country. $200 billion to the wealthiest 5,000 family dynasties in the country. 99.99% of all Americans won't see a penny from this giveaway. But you know who would benefit? Mr. Mnuchin and President Trump. And it doesn't stop there. On top of all of this, the Mnuchin-Trump proposal would also give the top tenth of 1%, the wealthiest of the wealthy, the corporate CEOs and hedge fund managers that make around $4 million per year or more, $1 million back each and every year. This group of elite earners already takes home a whopping 184 times the average pay and has the same combined net worth as nearly 90% of all American workers. These 160,000 of the richest families in the country have as much wealth as 144 million families in America. And look, I have nothing against wealthy people. I have nothing against millionaires and billionaires. Many worked hard for their money. They play by the rules. I applaud their success. But I don't think the wealthy, who are doing just fine right now, need an extra $1 million or more than the middle class. And I don't think we should be borrowing trillions more from China just to give the top 1/10 of 1% another $1 million. It's fundamentally backwards. Fundamentally backwards. They say we can't afford to invest in infrastructure. We can't afford to help our graduates from mounting college debt. We can't afford to give a whole host of resources to things that we think are critical to compel our nation to be the continuing global economic leader. But we can't afford to give $1 million away to all the millionaires and billionaires in the country. This warped order of priorities is a perfect metaphor for Mr. Mnuchin's School of Economics. Give the rich more and more because they know best. Well, unfortunately, the theory of trickle-down economics doesn't work, hasn't worked in the past, won't work now. I think the American people are sick and tired of getting fleeced. They're tired of working hard every day and playing by the rules only to fall further behind. They're tired of losing in a rigged system. But a Treasury Department led by Mr. Mnuchin will only deliver more of the same. More tax breaks for the very wealthiest in the country, more borrowing from China, more income inequality. These are not the principles Americans want or need. So in conclusion, Mr. President, you can tell a lot about a person based on how they handle a crisis. When Wall Street crashed and the country plunged into recession, where was Mr. Mnuchin? Was he warning regulators that they were asleep at the wheel and hardworking Americans were being exploited? Was he working to reform the broken system? No, he was looking for stores to raid with one goal in mind: profits. Some would like to either ignore or whitewash this past, but if we don't learn from history, we are doomed to repeat it. And the American people cannot afford a repeat of that past. We cannot afford a return to the Wild West of Wall Street, when the middle class was held hostage to the earnings reports of the biggest banks, when the cure for income inequality was simply more tax cuts for the wealthiest. We need a Treasury Secretary who will stand up to Wall Street, not take orders from them. We need a Treasury Secretary who understands that the strength of our country has come and will always come from that middle class, not from the CEOs and the hedge funds. Unfortunately, Mr. Mnuchin is not that person. I urge my colleagues to oppose his nomination, and I yield the floor.